right, y'all. Good morning. Welcome to Masters of Creativity. It's great to see you all today. Thanks for joining us. Good to see a bunch of familiar faces, some new names as well. Excited to see folks from Saudi Arabia and Paraguay and San Francisco and India and Tanzania and all over the world. It's amazing. Istanbul's in the house, Boston, Sonoma, Brazil. It's incredible to see so many of you gathered from so far away. Thank you for joining us. I know in some parts of the world, it's late at night. Some parts of the world, it's mid-afternoon, and some parts it's in the morning. So we're delighted to get to be here together with you today. I'm Jeremy, and I am joined by the one and only Ozan Varol, who is going to be sharing with us some of his exceptional research and some of his exceptional expertise. I would like to take just a moment to introduce Ozan in case you don't know him. He is a rocket scientist and an award-winning professor and a best-selling author as well. He's one of the world's foremost experts in creativity, innovation, and critical thinking. He's a native of Istanbul, Turkey, and he grew up in a family of no English speakers. Pretty amazing. He learned English as a second language and moved to the US by himself at 17 to attend Cornell and major in astrophysics. From there, he served on the operations team for the 2003 Mars Exploration Rovers project, and then sent 2 rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, to Mars. We are thrilled that we get to learn from him today. And if you have questions, as always, drop them in the chat, please, because that's one of the beauties of being on Zoom. We're here, 135 of us together on Zoom, and we'd love to make this as interactive as possible. So Ozan is going to take the floor. He'll share some of his initial framing and expertise with us, and then hopefully we can have a rich discussion based on whatever your interests are. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming our special guest.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. So excited to be here with all of you this morning. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. Can you see that, Jeremy?
Yes.
Okay. So in September 1962, President John F. Kennedy stepped up to the podium at Rice University Stadium and pledged to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. Now, at the time, this pledge was quite literally a moonshot, because so much of what would be required to actually put a person on the moon just hadn't been done yet. No American astronauts had worked outside of a spacecraft. 2 spacecraft had never docked together in space. NASA didn't know if the surface of the moon was solid enough to support a lander. They didn't know if the communication system would work on the moon. Kennedy said some of the metals required to build the rockets haven't even been invented. And just less than 7 years after Kennedy's pledge, Neil Armstrong took his giant leap for mankind. And just to set that accomplishment even in more historical context, a child who was 6 years old when the Wright brothers took their first powered flight, which lasted about 10 seconds and moved about 100 feet, that 6-year-old child would be 72 when flight became powerful enough to put a person on the moon. Like, think about that for a moment. That's 66 years from Wright brothers to Neil Armstrong. That giant leap, taken within a single human lifespan, is often celebrated as the triumph of technology. But it really wasn't. It was a triumph of a certain creative process, a thought process that rocket scientists used to turn the seemingly impossible into the possible. And I talk about that thought process in my book, Think Like a Rocket Scientist, which came out almost 3 years ago now, at the height of the pandemic. It was Adam Grant's #1 pick of his top 20 books of 2020. And I am, over the next hour or so, I'm going to share with you the moonshot process that I cover in the book. So reimagine, experiment, accelerate, and achieve. I really want this to be interactive though. So please drop comments and questions into the chat. Every now and then I'll pause and take a look. And I'm also going to take pauses throughout the presentation to take questions about what I covered. So anything you're curious about, anything you want me to touch on, please drop it into the chat. And yeah, really looking forward to having an engaging, interactive discussion. So beginning with reimagination. So I'm going to share with you a couple of ideas that I talk about in the book, beginning with backcasting. Now, when most of us think about the future, we engage in forecasting. So we look at our current skill sets, current education, whatever that might be, and we forecast what our future might be like a year from now, 5 years from now. Businesses do the same thing. So they take last year's budgets, last year's resources, last year's customers, and they extrapolate all of that into the future, often with little modification. Now, forecasting is a fine exercise, but it does come with a problem. And the problem is that it begins with the status quo. So it takes all of our problematic biases and assumptions embedded into the status quo and just projects them out into the future. Backcasting flips the script. Instead of beginning with the status quo, backcasting begins with an ideal reality in the future and requires you to work backward from the future. So Back to the Future, Back from the Future, one of my favorite movies. And so this is, by the way, what NASA did with the first lunar landing. They didn't just ask themselves, well, what can we do given what we have? We never would have gotten to the moon in 7 years if that was the mindset that they were operating with. Rather, they began with Neil Armstrong on the lunar surface in 1969 and then worked backward from that to determine exactly what they had to do to make that vision a reality. So they created this concrete roadmap, and each of the Apollo missions became essentially steps in that particular roadmap to make that audacious moonshot a reality. You can do this in your own personal life. And incidentally, backcasting and moonshot thinking are the reason why I'm speaking to you today. As Jeremy mentioned, I grew up in a family of no English speakers. We lived in this small apartment in Istanbul. We didn't have reliable access to electricity. So we'd have these blackouts frequently, and they would terrify me as a 5-year-old boy. So my dad came up with a game. We'd light a bunch of candles. He'd grab my soccer ball, and then he'd rotate the soccer ball around one of the candles to show me how the Earth rotated around the sun. Those were my first astronomy lessons, and I was hooked. My moonshot in middle school becoming an astronaut one day. And I remember walking into the library and researching the background of every single astronaut who had ever worked at NASA. And my goal was to determine exactly what they did to make their goal a reality. And so I wasn't calling it that at the time, but essentially I was backcasting. So I had this audacious goal of becoming an astronaut, and I worked backward from that to determine what I had to do. So I learned English as a second language. I researched how to get into colleges in the United States. I taught myself computer programming, and I took a number of actions, which, by the way, I didn't get my moonshot. Never became an astronaut, although we'll see what Elon and Jeff do. But I got to work on, as Jeremy mentioned, the Mars Exploration Rovers mission, which is one of the most successful interplanetary missions of all time. And if I wasn't aiming high, and if I hadn't combined that with a concrete roadmap through backcasting of making that dream, that moonshot a reality, I wouldn't have written Think Like a Rocket Scientist, and I would not be speaking to you today. So that's backcasting. I think that's a really powerful way to question outdated assumptions and let your vision dictate your future versus letting your present dictate your future. Another really powerful way to reimagine what's possible is to reframe the problem. Now, we often assume that breakthroughs would begin with a smart answer, but often breakthroughs begin with a smart question that reframes the problem that you're facing. So I'm going to share with you an exercise from Stanford. It's a Stanford professor. Her name is Tina Seelig. She does this exercise in her class on entrepreneurship. She walks into the class, she breaks the class into different teams, and she says each team will get $5 in seed funding. And your goal as a team is to make as much money as possible in 2 hours and then give a 3-minute presentation to the class. So this is the basic setup of the exercise. You've got $5, got to make as much money as possible in 2 hours and give a 3-minute presentation to the class. Now, if you've read my book or if you've heard about this exercise before, please remain silent. But the rest of you, I'd love to hear in the chat. So just put it into the chat what you would do if you were a student in this class. I'm going to give you a minute or two to think about it. anything is allowed. So trading items is absolutely allowed, and that could be a great way, right? So you begin with one thing and then you trade up to something else. Okay, so Stephanie says buy supplies to make food and drinks to sell. Owen has a similar idea. So buy and resell soda or candy on campus to hungry and thirsty Stanford students. Nikki says gamble, put it all in red and see what happens. Julie has a collaborative idea. So pooling money with the rest of the class. Place some bets. Okay, Atif has a great idea. So selling my class notes. I'm going to return to that. Invest, very nice. Plays well with the Silicon Valley environment here. Can you solicit outside support? Absolutely, Erica. Nice. Okay, so Michelle's question is a great segue into what actually happened. So Michelle asks, do you actually need to use the money? And the answer is absolutely no. So the teams, and let me share with you what actually happened. The teams that did not, so came at the sort of the bottom half of the class in terms of the amount of money raised, actually used the $5. So they ended up setting up like a car wash, for example, on campus and buying materials to wash cars and then washing cars, or setting up a lemonade stand. And those teams did raise money, but they didn't do as well as some of the other teams. The best performing teams did not use the $5 at all. They realized that the $5 is essentially a distracting and worthless resource. So they reframed the problem differently. Instead of asking themselves, well, what do we do to make the most amount of money using this $5? They asked themselves, what do we do to make the most amount of money if we start with nothing at all? So one particularly successful team ended up making reservations at popular Silicon Valley restaurants and then selling the reservation times to wealthy Silicon Valley executives who wanted to skip the wait. They ended up making, I think, $350 in just 2 hours without using the $5 at all. But the team that came in first place framed the problem even more differently. They realized that both the $5 and the 2 hours weren't the most valuable resource in their toolbox. Rather, the most valuable resource in their toolbox was this 3-minute presentation time that they had in front of a captivated Stanford class. They ended up selling that 3-minute presentation slot to a company interested in recruiting Stanford students and walked away with $650. Now, I love that story and this exercise that Tina runs for a number of reasons, but I'm going to focus on one thing here, which is the difference between strategy and tactics, which that example illustrates. And we often use these terms interchangeably, but they actually refer to different things. As strategy is a plan for achieving an objective, whereas tactics are the tools you use, the actions you take to implement the strategy. The Stanford teams who didn't perform as well on the $5 challenge fixated on the tactic and lost sight of the strategy. So they fixated on the $5 and lost sight of what they were actually trying to accomplish. But as Neil Gaiman reminds us, tools can be the subtlest of traps. So just because a $5 bill is sitting in front of you doesn't make it the most effective tool for the job. It's like that saying, right? If you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If you're too fixated on the $5 tactic, which in most people's cases tends to be something that you've always done, right? And businesses get into this problem as well. Like, we've always done it this way. We've always used this tactic that may have been a $10,000 tactic 10 years ago, but now it's a $5 tactic, yet people find themselves still using it because it's in front of them. That's what they have always done. So ask yourself, what's the $5 tactic in your life? We all have them. How do you reframe the problem so that you can spot the more valuable 2 hours or the most valuable 3-minute, that 3-minute presentation time sitting right in front of your nose? This often requires you to move from the what to the why. So asking yourself, what is the $5 tactic here for? In the case of the $5 challenge, it was to make as much money as possible. But what is it for can be a really, really powerful question, and something that I ask myself on a regular basis. Like, why am I doing what I'm doing. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I would begin my day by checking email. That was my $5 tactic. That's just what I did. And then I realized, that's the most creative hour of my day. And I'm spending it writing these short emails that only one person is going to read. So that was an example of a $5 tactic in my life, something that I just kept doing because that's just what I did. I'd wake up in the morning and I'd check email and answer emails. And asking that question, what is it for? Which is, well, email is for, certainly I need to exchange messages with people, but it doesn't need to be done at 8 a.m. during my most creative hour or two in the morning. And so that I abandoned that $5 tactic, and now I begin my day with writing and email, and other things can come later in the day. So what is it for can be a really powerful way of identifying outdated tactics, zooming out and seeing other possibilities that you may have initially missed. One final idea that I want to talk about in the reimagine section, and then I'm going to pause so we can take some questions, is putting yourself on airplane mode. We're living in a world where we're constantly on. So we're constantly moving from one meeting to the next, one notification to the next, one email to the next, without pausing, reflecting, and having time to think. Reimagining the status quo requires thinking, and most of us devote zero time to thinking. When people say, and I often hear this a lot when I share this particular idea with them, they'll say, well, I don't have time to think. And my response is, don't make me pull out your phone and look at your screen time. I don't have time to think means thinking is not a priority for me. And I think a lot of us don't devote any time to thinking, in part because when we think, it seems like nothing is happening, right? So when you're just daydreaming, looking out the window, it seems like nothing is happening. Whereas like if you're answering emails, you can see visible progress toward inbox 0. But appearances deceive. When you let your mind drift, when you devote time to spending time just with your thoughts, your subconscious is actually hard at work. It's connecting dots, it's forming new associations, it's marrying the old with the new to create new ideas. Hustle is antithetical to innovation. Innovation and creativity require you to chill. If you're not chilled, if you're constantly focused on these external threats in the form of, say, items on your to-do list or emails sitting unanswered in your inbox, you're going to zero in on those threats. So you're going to be tense, and tension creates constriction and contraction. You're going to zero in on these $5 tactics and then miss larger possibilities that are lurking in plain sight. Ideas don't arrive with a bang. There is no parade. The big thing never screams that it's a big thing. The big thing actually initially looks quite small. And if there is no void in your life, if your life is filled with constant chatter, you won't be able to hear that subtle whisper when it arrives. And this, by the way, is the reason why, like most people, your best ideas come to you in the shower. And people find this weird, but it's not weird at all. It's one of the few times in your day where you're doing nothing but just sitting there or standing there with no distractions. It's just you and your thoughts alone. Now imagine, and so your best ideas come to you in the shower. Imagine what those ideas might look like, both in terms of quantity and quality, if you're actually intentional about putting yourself on airplane mode throughout the day. So the way that this works in my own day-to-day work, you're looking at my office right now, there's a chair right here. I will sit on that chair at least 20 minutes a day. And I would start with 20 minutes if you're just starting out. And I would put it on your calendar as airplane mode. So putting yourself on airplane mode, and you have to show up just like a meeting. And I'll sit there with a pen and a notepad and just jot down whatever comes up. On many days, nothing comes up. When things do come up, 95% of them are junk. So utterly useless stuff that's just floating through my head. But here's the thing. I found that I need to get the junk out on paper for the gems that are buried in my subconscious to bubble up to the surface, to emerge up to the surface. And sometimes ideas don't come during that airplane mode session itself. But if I take the time to actually do that exercise on a regular basis, ideas will pop up. Once I've taken the time to clear out that junk in my head, ideas will pop up at unexpected moments throughout the day. Walking is also really useful. So research shows that walking boosts creativity, and there are countless examples of scientists literally walking themselves into the right answer. So they'll be stuck in a problem, they'll be working on it, and then they'll move from focus to unfocus. So from working at their desk to taking a walk, no audiobook, no podcast, nothing, right? It's just you and your thoughts. And then during that walk, the answer will magically, as if by magic, present itself to them. So I encourage you to do this in your life, and you'll find that taking your foot off the pedal can be the best way to accelerate. And I'm going to pause here, Jeremy, to see if there are any questions that I can answer about this first stage of reimagination.
I'm just writing down that that quote. I think it's great. Taking your foot off the pedal can be the best way to accelerate. So I'll let you, if you want, look in the chat.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. Yep.
But there's just while you're looking, I'll tell you one thing that I thought was pretty interesting is a question. Let me see. Garrett asked it a moment ago. He said, for some people, they need a prompt or guide rules or parameters or routine to start the creative process. When should those tactics, as opposed to strategy, be questioned or abandoned or reevaluated?
Let me see if I can find the question here.
Garrett,
can you read that one more time?
Yeah, Garrett, I can spotlight you in a second so we can see you. For some people, they need a prompt or guide rules or parameters or routine to start the creative process. When should those tactics be questioned or abandoned or reevaluated?
Okay, great. It's a great question, Garrett. And so what I'm sharing with you is what works for me. It may not work for you. So I would encourage you to experiment with this. Some people find it valuable to, and this is me as well, although even I vary this practice too. On most days, I won't walk in with a prompt. When I'm like doing journaling, for example, it's just sort of open-ended and I'm writing down whatever comes up. Sometimes I will walk in with a prompt. So when I do actually want to brainstorm, so like I've got a new book coming out, which actually the galley is just arrived. This is coming out in April, called Awaken Your Genius, Escape Conformity, Ignite Creativity, and Become Extraordinary. The title for the book was something I really struggled with. And a lot of my brainstorming sessions, I would walk into them with an explicit question of, what do I want to title the book? And then I would go for quantity of ideas. So like, I'd set aside any notions of, well, that's unreasonable. So my goal was to separate idea generation from idea evaluation. The goal was to just get as many ideas down on paper as possible without judging them, without evaluating them, without criticizing myself. Because I found, and research certainly bears this out as well, if you try to combine the two, if you try to evaluate ideas at the same time that you're generating them, you'll actually hamper your creativity. Because your inner critic will come into the picture and say, oh, that's stupid, or that's unreasonable, or that can't be done. But here's the thing, ideas that make a big impact will seem unreasonable at first, because if they were reasonable, someone else would have thought of them already. So if your inner critic is at the forefront and constantly criticizing you and judging you, then it's sort of like trying to drive, going back to the pedal analogy, trying to drive with your foot on the accelerator and the brake at the same time. And so separating idea generation from idea evaluation is really helpful. And I have these like ridiculous internal conversations with my inner critic sometimes, and I'll say, thank you for your input, but we're in idea generation phase now. I'm just generating ideas. I'd love your input when evaluation comes into the picture, but for now, you're in the back seats where you can't reach the brake pedal. I'm just going to write down as many ideas as possible using that as a prompt. And then we're going to sit down and evaluate and judge these ideas. So I would encourage you to experiment to see what works and what doesn't work for you, because a tactic that works really well for me may not for you. And really the only way to figure out is to experiment with it.
All right. I love, hey buddy, you're in the back seat right now. That's great. Owen, who I just pulled up on the screen here. Hey, Owen, thanks for your great question. He asked, does airplane mode mean completely being alone with your thoughts, or is doing a more analog activity such as reading acceptable in airplane mode?
I define airplane mode as just me and my thoughts, because even when you're reading, you're still intaking information from the outside world. And by the way, I love reading. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you shouldn't be reading at all. I spend a lot of time reading. But I think we don't spend a lot of time thinking and mining ourselves for insights. And I think there's a lot of value to doing that. And one of the things I do, and this is part of my creative process too, and this changed over the years. So when I was a professor for about 10 years. And whenever I would write a new article, I would begin with research. So I'd first see sort of like what else has been written on the topic. And then I found that the ideas that I would generate weren't as creative as they could be, because when I started with the research, the ideas that I would get would be anchored by what I had read. So they would deviate, but they would deviate only slightly from the opinions of the other academics in the field. And then I switched that to begin with. So if I'm interested in writing about something, I begin not by reading first, but with airplane mode, with me writing what I think about that topic. So like if I'm curious, for example, about where good ideas come from, instead of reading Stephen Johnson's excellent book on the topic first, I want to brainstorm about it myself. So I want to write down ideas on like, okay, well, where do I think good ideas come from? If I begin with reading, my ideas are going to be influenced by what I read. But if I begin with just first going in, so thinking before researching, then my insights end up being more original. So there's a time and place for both, for sure. Then you need to turn to reading what other people have read. But beginning with thinking is really helpful.
Yeah, these are great questions, folks. Okay, yeah, and thanks, Owen, for the awesome question. As Will did and some others have done, if you see a question you like, just +1 it. That way we can draw attention where folks are interested. But I'd say, Ozan, for the sake of time, let's keep rolling.
Sure, sounds good. And I think that point about, sort of experimenting, seeing what works and what doesn't work for you is a good segue into this next section on experimentation. So in the first section, which was called Reimagine, the idea is to generate ideas, right? About what you can do. The next step is to take those ideas and actually run some experiments. And if there's any formula I followed in my life, it's this: stop overthinking, start experimenting, learning and improving. Because you can make all the pros and cons lists that you want, but you will not know what's going to work and what's not going to work until you try. So if you're thinking about going to law school, go sit in on a law school class. I was a law professor for 10 years and I taught countless students who came to law school because their uncle is a lawyer or because someone told them they're good at debate, which are not good reasons to go to law school, by the way. None of them had ever sit in on a law school class. None of them had ever, well, I wouldn't say none of them, most of them hadn't sit in on a law school class. Most of them had an intern at a local law firm to see what being a lawyer is actually like on a day-to-day basis. If you're thinking about becoming a neurosurgeon, shadow a neurosurgeon for a day. Talk to neurosurgeons who love what they do, but also talk to neurosurgeons who don't like what they do, who didn't enjoy what they did and ended up leaving the field. If you're thinking about starting a podcast, experiment, commit yourself to doing 10 episodes, just experiment with it and see if you enjoy it or not. But it's really easy to be paralyzed by pros and cons, which can be helpful to think about, but really the only way that you're going to be able to figure out whether you're going to like something and whether something is going to work for you is to actually try it. And the best experiments have this I wonder what will happen quality to them, right? So the goal isn't to be correct, it's to discover. And actually experiments that generate unexpected outcomes tend to be more valuable than experiments that confirm what you think is actually true. And there are three questions that I ask myself when I run an experiment with my own life. What am I testing? So you're running an experiment and you should see what, you should figure out ahead of time what the thing you're going to be testing is. And actually, I'll give you a really recent example from my own life. Yesterday, I did a talk, and someone in the audience I saw in the chat was actually at that talk as well. I did a virtual talk yesterday, and one of the things that I wanted to test as an author leading up to a book launch, you're testing different types of language to describe the book to see what's going to resonate with people. And we had several hundred people at this virtual event yesterday, and I wanted to test this like 3-sentence thing from the book to see if it would resonate with people. So I wanted to say it, and then I would figure out, and this is the second question I asked myself, what does failure look like? What does success look like? Failure would have meant crickets in the comments section. Success would have meant people saying, oh my God, I love that idea, or I love the way that you described that. And which is what ended up happening yesterday. A bunch of people not only posted it in the comments, but tagged me on social media, on LinkedIn and Instagram and all of these platforms. Someone generated a meme with that sentence that I had said on it, which is good data as an author for me to know, because I know that particular sentence actually resonates with the audience that I'm trying to reach. Again, this is not a scientific experiment; it's just a very informal one, but it happened yesterday, so I wanted to share that with you. And defining the criteria for failure and success at the outset is really important before emotional investments and sunk costs begin to cloud your judgment. So you should define at the outset, what does failure look like and what does success look like? And then always have an end date for your experiment. So when will the experiment end? Someday is not a good answer. So pick a date, put it on your calendar. It's much easier to start things than to end things. So it's important to have an exit plan, to say, I'm going to record 10 podcast episodes, and my metric for success is, you can have an internal metric for success, right? I'm having a ton of fun doing these interviews. I'm learning a lot. You can have external metrics for success. So I want to reach, say, 1,000 downloads per episode by the end of episode 10. And then once you define those criteria at the outset, it becomes much easier to judge at the end of that 10 episode experiment whether the experiment is actually working or not. I think most people wait for perfect clarity about the path ahead before getting started. And I love this quote from Rumi. He says, as you start to walk on the way appears. The implication being, the way is not going to appear until you start walking. There is no flashlight powerful enough to illuminate what's going to come for you. The only way to know is to start walking. And with each step you take, you go from not knowing to knowing, from darkness to light. Some of the paths that you take aren't going to work out, and that's also data. I read this book on line tracking recently, and there was by Boyd Vardy. I think it's called The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life. And he says something like, the path of not here is part of the path of here. So if you spend the summer at a law firm interning, and that summer is miserable, that's the path of not here. It's not here. That's not what you were looking for, but that is the path of here. Because now you've figured out that you don't want to be a lawyer. You've avoided 3 years of law school and $150,000 in debt. So experimenting and trying out different paths and possibilities, and then emerging your life, or allowing your life to emerge as you discover what works and what doesn't, ends up being really I think the most optimal way to figure out what's really aligned for you. It also ends up being a lot more fun. Like life turns into this never-ending experiment, this sort of like laboratory of sorts, where you're just trying out different futures and seeing what works for you and what doesn't.
Okay, we've got to pause because there's a really
Yeah.
good question here.
Yes.
And it's direct. It's just so timely for this
Yeah,
moment.
let's do it.
Because folks are really resonating with the Rumi quote and the idea of the path reveals itself. How does that, not that we have to square it, but talk about the tension between that and backcasting? Because backcasting presumes you know the answer,
sure.
now it's work backwards. And the Rumi quote
Yep.
presumes you can't know the answer, but you got to move forward. How do you think about both of those things?
Awesome. Whoever asked that question, that is brilliant. And I think there is a surface level contradiction between the two, but I think there's a way to reconcile the two. Which is to say, with backcasting, you create this plan for making your moonshot a reality, but you are not wedded to that plan, right? And so it's important for you to know what the first step in the process is going to be. And that's where backcasting comes into play. You take that first step, and then you get information that you didn't have when you first started out, right? And once you have that information, now you can alter the plan. Now you've got data that you didn't have before. And so what you thought would have been the second or third step in the process no longer are the optimal steps. So then you deviate. So then you change. So I'm really glad you asked that question, because when you do come up with a roadmap through backcasting, the goal isn't to treat that like a religious text and just like stick to it. It's to be more flexible. It's to use that as a way of taking this big audacious goal, breaking it to these doable smaller steps, but not letting those steps constrain you, and being more flexible and open to information as it comes along, as you start walking down the path. And you might say, well, you know what, there's a shortcut over here that I didn't see before. Or there's this other path over here, another way of doing something that's actually better than what I expected it might be. Or life just throws a curveball at you. So then you have to throw the entire plan out the door, right? So then the whole plan you created with backcasting goes out the door. But I think backcasting is still important because it pivots you to the future, and then it gives you initial steps you can take. But the goal is to make sure you're not those steps, that you own those steps and those steps don't own you.
That's beautiful. The way I kind of framed it there, Ozan, is backcast, experiment, iterate, backcast again.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. So it's just like a continuous, never ending process. And I think I'll give you an example from my life. So when Think Like a Rocket Scientist came out, it came out in April 2020. So this was the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I had this big, beautiful book tour planned, which obviously had to be canceled. So I had applied backcasting and came up with this plan for, making the book as successful as it could possibly be. I had to throw all of that out the window. And here's the interesting thing. So as I went back to square one and thought about ways that I could raise awareness about the book and sell the book, and there were so many challenges. Amazon wasn't prioritizing book deliveries, so lots of things going on. But as I went back to the drawing board, I actually realized that my initial plan had been flawed. The book tour for me would have been the $5 tactic. And I had planned the book tour not because that was the best way to get the word out about the book, but because that's what other authors do, right? As like this first-time author, I thought, well, you write a book and then you go on a book tour, not realizing how timely a book tour can be. And that actually there are other ways of getting the word out about the book that are far more efficient than me flying to New York to walk into a Barnes and Noble and talk to 150 people and then fly back to Portland. And so I ended up, for example, teaming up with other authors who were in a similar position that I was, who also had pandemic book launches. And we ended up doing these events together that ended up, I'm confident, far more successful than my original plan would have been. And that curveball that I got made me realize that the initial tactic that I was planning to use was a $5 tactic. Okay, so test as you fly as you test. is another concept from rocket science that relates to experimentation. And it's really simple. It just basically says that the experiment has to take place in conditions that mimic reality. So in rocket science, we subject spacecraft, every component of the spacecraft, to the same types of shocks and vibrations that the spacecraft is going to experience in flight. That's the test as you fly portion. And then the flight itself has to take place in conditions as similar as possible to the test. Because any sort of deviance between the experiment and the test can cause catastrophe in a thing as complicated as a rocket, but this is true in our personal lives as well. So when you run experiments, you want to make sure that you're running them in real life conditions. So watching Law and Order is not a great way to see if you're actually going to enjoy law school or being a lawyer, because that's a TV show so wildly disconnected from reality. The same idea applies to designing products and services. The iPhone is a great example here. The iPhone, most businesses fail at this, by the way. They run experiments in conditions that don't mimic reality. The iPhone was a complete failure in surveys released before it came out, or surveys conducted before it came out. So when people were asked, this is like, I think a year before the iPhone came out, when people were asked if they would enjoy having one portable device that could fulfill all of their needs, only 30% of Americans said yes. So people, 70% seem to prefer having a separate phone, a separate camera, and a separate music player, as opposed to one device that could fulfill all of those functions. And Steve Ballmer, who was the CEO of Microsoft at the time, famously said, there is zero chance that the iPhone is going to get any significant market share. Now, the iPhone didn't prove the survey wrong. The survey accurately measured people's responses to a device that they had never seen before. Hypothetically, thinking about the iPhone was very different than actually stepping into an Apple store, picking up this revolutionary new device and playing with it and interacting with it in your hands. That initial indifference from the survey quickly morphed into desire. So it's important for businesses to create products and services and prototypes for them and actually run them by real customers. So hand them to real customers to be able to get feedback from them. And in our personal lives, running experiments in real life conditions, talking to readers in person for me and running ideas by them and testing language to see what resonates and what doesn't ends up being a lot more accurate in terms of the data that you get versus experiments that just don't mimic reality. I'm going to pause there to see if there are any additional questions that I can answer before I move on to the final section here.
I would say let's keep moving to the final section, and then we can circle back to questions, because I want to make sure that you get to the heart of the.
Yeah, sounds good. And this is all, I think, I wouldn't call this the heart of it. It's all a part. I think a really important part. Each of these is really important parts of the process. Accelerate is all about learning. So Reimagine was about idea generation. Experimentation is about testing those ideas. Accelerate is learning from both failed and successful experiments. And I'm going to talk about failure here. Won't have time to get to learning from success, but I do want to spend some time on failure and learning from failure, because people find it really hard to fail. And so I want to share with you some ideas on how you can reframe failure and see it in a different light. I think the beginning point here is that failure is really scary. Part of this is genetic programming. Our ancestors who did not fear failure became lunch for saber-toothed tigers. So it becomes, and they just didn't live long enough to pass their genes onto us. That genetic programming, that genetic conditioning against failure is then reinforced by society. So growing up, failure gets us into the principal's office. Failure means you get grounded. Failure means you get your allowance cut. Failure means you don't get into the college that you wanted, or you don't get the job that you wanted. But we're now told to celebrate failure. Fail fast, often, fail forward. That mantra is really popular in Silicon Valley. Business books instruct entrepreneurs not just to embrace failure, but to celebrate it. There are now funerals being held for failed startups in Silicon Valley, complete with bagpipes and DJs spinning records and alcohol flowing freely. There are conferences like FailCon dedicated to celebrating failure. I don't buy it. And I don't buy it for two reasons. Number one, when you celebrate something, you often don't learn from it. And number two, regardless of what Silicon Valley tells us, failure sucks. Whoever says they celebrate failure and they don't mind failing, they're probably lying to you. I failed more times than I care to remember in my life, and every single time it sucked. Because there's a value judgment attached to failure, right? Success is good and failure is bad. But it can be just as dangerous to demonize failure as it is to celebrate it. Because behind every canvas unpainted, every business unlaunched, every song unsung, every book unwritten is that looming fear of failure. And we tend to think of failure as a loss, right? You know, I lost a year of my life working on this project, or I spent 2 years writing a book that bombed. But failure is a loss only if you call it that. Another way to think about failure is as an investment. And failure can be the best teacher if you know how to approach it properly. And I'll give you some ideas on how to do that in just a few minutes here. Failure gives you data that you can't get anywhere else. So one of the failures in my life, one of the many failures in my life, I wrote a book, an academic book. That was my first book that came out maybe 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And it was a failure. I think it sold less than 1,000 copies. And one of the big lessons that I learned from that failure was I tried to reach two very different audiences with the book. So I wanted to write a book that appealed to both academics and non-academics, and it ended up appealing to nobody. And I learned a really important lesson that I don't think I could have learned otherwise, of the importance of really drilling down on the audience that you're trying to reach. And of course, I had read about that concept in books before, but it really didn't hit home and really didn't resonate with me until I had that failure. Now, there are many things that went right with the book, and there's so much I learned from that process, but that particular lesson of you really need to pick your audience. You can't try to write a book that's going to appeal to everybody. It was such an important lesson for me to learn, and there is no way that I could have learned it at the level that I did without that particular failure. And if you're trying to achieve transformative things, you're not going to succeed on the first try. All breakthroughs are evolutionary, not revolutionary. I love this little sketch by Michelle Ryle about attempts and failures and successes. If you don't attempt anything, you're not going to fail, but success is also going to be not applicable. If you try a lot, you're also going to fail a lot. Most of your ideas will fail. A few of them will be good. Some of them will succeed and will compensate in spades for the things that didn't work. And if you're operating with this experimentation mindset of placing little bets, then the failures won't be as big, and the successes will compensate for the failures that actually do happen. Now, Einstein's first 7 proofs for E = mc² failed. Google has shut down 200 businesses. So they kill projects all the time. Thomas Edison famously said, "I haven't failed, I just found 10,000 ways that won't work." This is Sarah Blakely. She's the founder of Spanx, the apparel company. She went from selling fax machines door to door to becoming the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. And she credits her success partially to a question that her father would ask her and her brother when they were growing up. What did you fail at recently, and what did you learn from it? So contrast this question to the way that we normally interact with our students or our children, which is to focus on successes, to ask them about successes. In asking his children about what they failed at, Sarah's father gave them the breathing room to tackle interesting things and, yeah, to fail from time to time. To him, failing to try was far more disappointing than failure itself. And I love the learning question here, which is, what did you learn from it, right? And I think if I could change the fail fast, fail often mantra, I would change it to learn fast. The goal isn't to fail fast, because just because you're failing doesn't mean you're learning anything. The goal should be to learn. And there are two questions that I ask myself and that I would encourage you to ask as well when you fail. What went wrong with this failure? So for the academic book that I wrote that bombed, one of the things that went wrong was that I tried to appeal to everybody. But also, and this is a question that most businesses and most people don't ask, is what went right with this failure? It's possible to do some things right and still fail. And conversely, by the way, it's possible to do some things wrong and still succeed. These two questions I asked myself after both failures and successes. What went wrong with this failure? What went wrong with the success? And what went right with this failure? And what went right with the success? That has a way of taking the focus off of the outcome, so off of failure or success, and pivoting to inputs, to the things that actually matter. So there are a number of things that went right with that academic book that I mentioned, which is I actually learned how to tell really captivating stories. And that was one of the things in the book that I experimented with and that worked really well. And then I took what went right with that failure and I've applied it to the other books that I wrote since then. So Think Like a Rocket Scientist and then Awaken Your Genius, and brought in that storytelling aspect to convey principles through stories, was really something I learned during the process of writing a book that ended up not doing well. And I know we've got about 6 minutes left here, so let me pause to see if there are any questions I can answer, Jeremy. I love what Paul said. Failure is not an option. It's an often used quote. Ironic it was from a rocket scientist. I absolutely agree. I think that's one of the most flawed quotes about rocket science, is that idea of failure is not an option. Failure is an option. And rocket scientists fail all the time. The goal is to be able to learn from each failure, to iterate and improve over time. Alistair says success can also be a poor teacher. I completely agree. I have a whole chapter in Think Like a Rocket Scientist focused on that concept specifically, which is success can be a really lousy teacher, because when people are constantly succeeding, it's really easy to get complacent. It's really easy to assume that, you know, we're succeeding because we're genius, right? And discounting the role that luck and opportunity and privilege are playing in the process. And two of the biggest disasters in NASA history, Challenger and Columbia, both happened after a string of successes. Both happened after a string of successes, and I go into detail in this in the book, essentially led very capable managers at NASA to develop tunnel vision, to think that nothing can go wrong. So I love that comment. Okay, let's see if there are any other questions I can answer.
I think, Ozan, I think one thing that could be cool, and it's
Yeah.
a nice way to wrap, is if you want to just share the elevator pitch for your new book, because I know that you're working on it, and everybody here, I'm sure, would love to hear that. You'll be some of the first people to hear about it.
For sure, yeah, I'm happy to do that. I actually just put in, because somebody had asked what was the email list, I put in the URL into the chat if that didn't work. Okay, so the elevator pitch, which I'm still refining for Awaken Your Genius, is this: no one can compete with you at being you. You are the first and the last time that you'll ever happen. If your thinking is an extension of you, if what you're creating is a product of your inner genius, you will be in a league of your own. And genius, we tend to think, so awaken your genius means the most talented or the most intelligent. But genius in the words of Thelonious Monk, is the one most like himself. Genius, in the Latin origin of the word, is the spirit attendant at the birth of each and every person. So genius can be awakened in anyone. And my goal in this book is to give people tools to discard their unnatural programming and figure out their first principles. So the qualities that make up their own genius, to give them the tools to unlock their creativity and unleash original insights from their own depths. And the book also shares insights on how to, when you are taking information from external sources, to actually read with skeptical curiosity. And so that you're evaluating what you're reading and what you're taking in through your internal filters. And the goal is to give birth to your true self, to your genius, and the universe center you were meant to be.
Beautiful. I can't think of a better way to close than to encourage everyone to seek their true genius.